Good evening. First, I would like to j'aimerais remercier Marcel pour son introduction extrêmement généreuse. Extrêmement généreuse. He told me beforehand that he was going to surprise me. He did. And beware, I can handle difficult people. Now, I'm grateful to the organizers of this event for giving me the opportunity to talk about a major sociological mechanism that is paid very little attention, surprisingly little attention, in social sciences. One of my research projects focuses on the impact of culture on individual and collective behaviors, or on the interplay between symbols, discursive strategies, and social actors' agendas. A central question drives my analysis. How does a symbol or a simple idea come to enjoy a social efficacy and to gain the power to trigger social change or to prevent social change? This opens to a large array of sub-questions, such as what enables a society to mobilize around specific goals, or to bridge their divisions, to efficiently manage their tensions and conflicts, what allows societies to regroup and to respond forcefully after a crisis, after a trauma, etc. One way or another, all those questions resonate with culture, and more specifically, the symbolic foundation of a society. I approach culture first through the concept of collective imaginary. Within collective imaginaries, I distinguish between the underlying forces that belong to the unconscious and are analyzed by psychoanalysis or deep psychology. This is the domain of the hidden human drives and instincts. Hidden because sometimes we better hide it. At the second level, there are universal patterns or matrices that Gustav Jung called archetypes. This concept refers to strikingly identical frames, context-free, that come up in all cultures of all times, such as the figures of the newborn savior, the initial chaos, the golden age, the metamorphosis, the exodus, the renaissance, and so forth. Those themes are met in every culture at every time. Now there is a third level. Collective imaginaries comprise basic referentials or intellectual schematas, providing categories with which ideas can be built. Think of visions of time and space, visions of the universe, visions of life and death and so forth, self and others. And finally, a fourth component, which is made up of social representations. This is where we cross paths with myth. Through a number of myths in any society, the role of a collective imaginary is to institute and to reproduce a set of 5 basic relationships. First, a symbolic relationship to space, through which a geographical unit is transformed into a land, into a territory, or a homeland. Second, a relationship to the social, through which every individual is assigned a rank or a status on the scale of prestige. Third, a relationship to self and to other, which feeds an identity dynamics of inclusion and exclusion, or an us-them dichotomy. And finally, a fourth, a relationship to the past, expressed in collective memory, in narratives. And finally, a relationship to the future that generates social movement, collective undertakings, utopias, or any kind of anticipation, including the sense of a mission in the history. Again, I assume that each of those relationships, to various degrees, feeds on myth. So I will devote a lot of attention to this notion tonight. What is a myth? Myths have a bad reputation, and for very good reasons. In the mind of most people, the notion bears a reference to the distortions, to lies, manipulation, alienation, and so forth. But myth can also carry much more positive contents. Think of democracy, freedom, equality, peace, all those great ideals that have propelled the evolution of the Western world since the 18th century. Broadly speaking, myths are collective representations, detrimental or beneficial, that convey meanings, beliefs, religious or not, principles, values, and ideals. In this respect, myth must be seen as a universal sociological device which can carry all kinds of symbolic contents, positive or negative. And it is a mechanism that operates in all societies of all times. So I address myth as contextualized, acting within a specific social and historical setting. I could phrase this differently by saying that I stress the social dimension of myth as opposed to this psychological dimension, but I won't go into those intricacies here. I think that there are three characteristics that ground the distinctiveness of myth as collective representations. First, hybridity. A myth is always a mixture unevenly calibrated of reality and fiction, of reason and emotion, of conscientiousness and unconscientiousness, and of veracity and falseness. Myth is always all of that at the same time. For this reason, the analysis of myth invites to bypass those dichotomies and to work in between somehow. Second, there is a kind of sacredness about myth that confers on their contents a self-constraining power quite similar to taboos. And thanks to this attribute, it is deemed preposterous to question or to attack a prevailing myth. For instance, logic and rationality in the Western world as a source of progress, particularly in the field of science. This is a very powerful myth. Maleness in frontier areas, everywhere, in Australia, in Canada, Quebec, United States, and so forth. Maleness was a very powerful myth. Freedom in liberal societies. Racial equality in black communities. Respect for ethnic diversity in Canada, a very powerful myth. Gender equality, just about everywhere now in the Western world. Or the nation itself as a sanctuary of the homeland with its past epics, saviors, fallen heroes, and that sort of things. Any criticism of the core message of a full-fledged myth is likely to be met with an emotional, if not an aggressive response, and an outright rejection, rather than a cold, methodic examination and rational discussion. As a symbolic device, myth has this capacity to impose itself upon individuals rather than being chosen. And once firmly established, myth possess, at least for some time, the power to perpetuate themselves without the support of an enforcing or a sanctioning body, which is absolutely remarkable. The third distinctive characteristic, when they are efficient, social myths empower. They generate energy and strength that are used to promote or to resist social change, to stimulate resilience, and to drive individuals' endeavors. How does an idea or a symbol become a myth? Well, we intellectuals, and this includes Viv Nellis here.
It's a big tent.
That's a relief. We intellectuals come up with thousands of ideas every year in our conferences, lectures like this one, and so forth. However, as we know, and perhaps fortunately, most of them will die after a few months, if not after a few days. But how come that one of them, 20, 40 years down the road, will burgeon and enjoy the power of a full-fledged myth? The answer lies in what I call the five-step metafication process. You ready for the 5 steps? Yes. Yeah. Step 1, the initial framing. You can imagine the original message or idea. They come from various sources or networks, academia, arts, literature, media, politics, and so forth. It is a statement about values, beliefs, ideals, possibly supplemented with directions for action, what we should believe in, what we should do, and how, and so forth. This is a simple enunciation. Step 2, diffusion. The initial message must be disseminated within the network of its origin. And in the process, it undergoes alterations. It can even receive new formulations, while the core message apparently remains unchanged. Step 3, instrumentalization. Through additional successive framings and reframings, the message is promoted and circulated beyond the network of its inception, thanks to various social actors, lobbies, associations, political parties, militant groups, and so forth. Social actors who use the message as a tool or a resource to advance their agenda. Step 4, institutionalization. Further intense promotion by regulatory bodies, school system, church, state, local authorities, family, and so on, by various networks, media, creates a large consensus around the message. And that leads to a situation where the initial symbolic content is not taken for granted. It has penetrated the mainstream culture and has been deeply internalized. As for the practical outcome of this 4th step, the initial message now assumes the form of a widely endorsed value, an ideology, an utopia, a moral principle, a norm, a common sense view, and so forth. But it is not an accomplished myth yet. This occurs at step 5 with Secureization. I think this is the defining moment of the metafication process. What takes place at this step is what I call a cognitive shift, whereby reason takes a back seat while an emotion-driven mechanism takes over as the main engine. The term Secureization refers either to the sacred stricto sensu, like in the case of religious beliefs, or more generally, to all forms of transcendence defined as a set of compelling symbols whose strength is rooted in absolutes. Finally, in terms of practical outcomes, the full-fledged myths are expressed in icons, heroes, monuments, rituals, and other forms of celebration. As I said, the most crucial moment, and also the most puzzling in this metafication process, is the cognitive shift that takes place in step 5. What factors activate this mechanism? I offer a preliminary answer among several other possibilities. First, one must figure out an original wound in the past of a society or a social group, such as a military defeat, a painful experience of humiliation, of exploitation, a time of great misery, and that sort of thing, followed by a period of suffering, and then the memory of the suffering. Contrary to a common view, I think that the goal of commemoration, at least in this case, is not to heal, but to reopen, to reenact the wound and the pain, to recreate the emotion and to refuel the myth. And this helps to account for the taboo dimension of a myth. If someone attacks the mythified message, it denies the wound and the suffering, and it reopens the pain. Therefore, the response is inevitably emotional rather than rational. As a result, in order to understand what happens in step 5, one is invited to look for a tragic path behind or beneath the myth, a painful narrative behind the social myth, a narrative that expresses the deepest fears and anxiety, the deepest hopes and feelings in a society. Some of the most powerful contemporary myths instantiate this scenario. Here are a few examples. The construction of the European Union, a very unexpected, unlikely undertaking after the wars, after years of wars between those nations. This construction, at the outset, drew on the ideal of peace and reconciliation as a response to the memory of the war's atrocities that those people have suffered. The core message was never again. That was the birthplace of the European Union. And that's the problem today of the Union, because this message is fading among the young generations, because it's too far away, or because the celebrations are not efficient enough. There might be different reasons. But the emotional pool of the European Union is depleting right now. Racial equality is rooted in the great suffering narratives, such as slavery, apartheid, genocides. Gender equality is a legacy of a long history of women domination and exploitation by men. And in the case of Quebec, this resonates very strongly. The French Republic's reluctance to recognize ethnicity and to grant accommodations in the public life echoes the deep-seated loathing of privileges and inequalities that has sparked the 1789 revolution. Secularism owes to a long past of intolerance and oppression by religions. The longing for equality and social justice in former colonial societies is a byproduct of enduring subordination, just like the sense of dignity can result from a past of humiliation. The ethos of national unity in the United States speaks a lot to the trauma of the Civil War. And a book has just been published lately on this topic, whose title is, it's not my invention, the title is The Republic of Suffering. Now, the suffering narrative is only one possibility. It's a very frequent possibility, but it's only one. One could think of other scenarios wherein the energizing, the constraining power of myth is rooted in different emotional settings. For instance, social myths can also play on fear and anxiety, on power and glory, feeding on great military achievements, on shame and guilt, the case of Germany nowadays. So what I call the emotional pool of myth can be variegated. From what precedes, one understands why the creation of a myth cannot be a one-way or top-down operation. Of course, for a new message to enjoy a strong currency in a population, it needs to be skillfully framed and promoted, but it also needs to connect with a dormant past. Overall, one could say that a myth is a threefold configuration: the narrative of an outstanding historical experience, A strong emotion emerging from this experience and carried by the narrative, and the translation of this emotion into a value, a belief, an ideal. The five-step process is front and central. It is assumed that an idea weighs on individual minds and impacts the course of a society in as much as it has successfully traveled throughout the five aforementioned steps. Or put otherwise, the farther it goes along this trajectory, the stronger the impact. Now, there are specific conditions that facilitate this process, this travel, and that affect the efficiency of a myth. Actually, there are a wide array of factors involved. I will only mention a few of them. First of all, an appearance, I say an appearance of consistency. The simple fact that the core message in itself seems to be free from blatant internal contradictions. Polysemy, the capacity of a message to carry simultaneously several meanings and sometimes competing meanings. Polyvalence, the capacity to serve different and again even conflicting social and political agendas. Relevance, the capacity to address the anxieties and the most pressing issues of the time, to provide the right meanings, to attend to the right needs, in other words, to be aligned with an era. Years ago, I would have said the capacity to match with the praxis, but we no longer use that term like that. No. It's, right. Historical resonance. That is a close connection with a vibrant, untapped emotional pool. Piggybacking. Piggybacking, the capacity of a new myth to link up with and to rely on old, well-established myths so as to partake of their authority. I could give very amazing examples of that during the 1960 campaign of the Liberal Party at the beginning of the Quiet Revolution. They were presenting their candidates who were not believers, who were bad guys. But then in the Devoir, there was a list of photos of them with a caption, "He's the brother of a priest. He's the father of the priest of this parish," and so forth. So he was a good guy. Piggybacking. Commemoration, the intensity and efficacy of the rituals designed to revisit and to rekindle the original pain. And finally, the last examples that I will mention, efficient discursive strategies are, of course, a major factor that call for rhetorics analysis. And this is an absolutely fascinating area. How the Soviet Unions managed to get the support of Poland after the Second World War. It's absolutely fascinating. Discursive strategies, very sophisticated symbolic devices. Absolutely fascinating. Let me introduce three more concepts. Most of the times in a society, myths come in a rather fragmentary, disorderly state. Their relational arrangements are always unpredictable. While some are complementary, others may be competing or conflicting, as I said. However, in particular circumstances, in the course of a society, it may happen that most of the prevailing myths will suddenly converge in such a way that an advance on one myth will reverberate on all others and will reinforce and push the whole configuration forward. Such an occurrence, expectedly, is conducive to deep, rapid social change, or in the opposite direction, to a very thick, deeply rooted status quo. That's what I call an archimyth. Not an archetype, but an archimyth. An archimyth is a comprehensive, overarching mythical configuration which encompasses and structures a set of converging myths in a particular moment in the history of the society. Archimyths are rather exceptional. That kind of alignment does not occur often in the history of a society. although I am able to give you 3 examples. I think that since the 1950s, Canada has witnessed, and I would rather say English Canada, has witnessed the emergence of an archimyth of that sort, built around the ideal of the decent, caring, moral society, which has been promoted lately as a world model, as you know. A second example is offered by the 1960s Quebec, where national emancipation and modernization were the backbone of the archimyth. And my third example is the USA, a society that has been defined as the new, unprecedented, free, redeeming nation. And you can link up every myth that was set forth in the history of the United States to this backbone. Second, I want to introduce the notions of master and derivative myth. At the most fundamental level, a collective imaginary is structured by mythical configurations that serve as the symbolic basis of the collective life. Those primary configurations act very much like paradigms in the sphere of science. One can view them as foundational, historically produced collective representations from which other representations are built. In other words, a collective imaginary is made up of foundational or master myth, from which other secondary myths are constructed in a derivative way. The master myths change very slowly. They are built for the long run, and their structuring power ensures that their durability. In turn, they are periodically translated into derivative or secondary myth, that is, sets of beliefs and values that are designed to meet the particular challenges of a given time. Quebec offers a good example in point, again. Several master myths have underpinned Quebec national imaginary over the last centuries. One of them is the sense of having suffered from multiple dependencies as a legacy of the 1760 conquest, the colonial rule, and an oppressive religious institution. This narrative has nurtured a willingness to right the wrongs of the past, a longing for collective affirmation for reconquest. At least 3 times, this master myth has been translated into a set of derivative myths in the history of Quebec. The first time at the beginning of the 19th century with the Patriot movement, the second time after 1840 with the emergence of the survival narrative, and the last episode occurred in the 1960s. Most of the myths that have driven the Quiet Revolution were derived from this same master myth: decolonization, social recovery, political autonomy, economic development, political modernity, social equality, secularization, French-Canadian entrepreneurship, and so forth. This was a textbook lesson as to how myth, master, and secondary can energize a society. Consequently, the structure of a collective imaginary may be seen as a complex pyramidal structure comprising a layer of rather stable master myth and a layer of transient derivative myth, which may sometimes coalesce into an archimyth. By virtue of their specific functions, derivative myths are expected to change periodically, say every 20, 40, 60 years, whereas the master myth remain mostly unaltered. It is also anticipated that the replacement of derivative myth will be associated with a period of instability and uncertainty. If so, one can imagine that a substitution at the level of the master myth will be even more distressing for a society. Needless to say, societies are reluctant to engage in that kind of dangerous and most destabilizing endeavors, and they tend to defer the dreaded prospect of an overhaul at that deepest level. And the best example I have in mind now is France, with its Republican myth that is confronted with the emergence of diversity, a hard rock that doesn't want to be reduced to another part of the Republic. And the response to France, contrary to other nations, is to harden those myths. And God knows what's going to happen. We don't know. I'm not sure this is the good remedy. So, France has distracted me. Finally, this distinction between master and the derivative myth accounts for a puzzling double characteristic of myth as we know them, in that they are both ephemeral and long-lasting. They are ephemeral under the light of the derivative myth, and they are long-lasting if you're referring to the master myth. The combination of master and derivative myth also provides a society with the means to constantly adapt and change, sometimes to radical breaks, and at the same time keep a sense of continuity and stability, essential for its survival. To sum up, myths are a universal collective feature, irrespective of times and places. They are a fundamental sociological mechanism. There is no such thing as a myth-free or a mythless culture or society. Any collective life needs and generates myth, which feed identities, inform ideologies, utopias, worldviews, and so forth. And as a consequence, it does not make sense to wonder whether one should be in favor or against myth, whether we'd better adopt or reject myth as collective representations. Myths are a mixture of reason and emotion, wherein the latter trumps the former. And being made up of reality and fiction, myths should be assessed not on the basis of their veracity, but on the basis of their efficacy. Achieving the status of taboos, they enjoy a self-defense mechanism, an immune system of sorts that allows them to largely escape criticism. And myths sometimes coalesce into an archimyth, and every collective imaginary presents itself as a hierarchy of master and derivative myth. Finally, you may have noticed that my approach and my assumptions radically depart from those of most anthropologists and literary historians, in that I do not address myth as purely fictional or as only harmful. I consider that they are as active as ever in our societies. I reject the evolutionist view that myths were typical of and restricted to the so-called primitive societies until, thanks to progress, reason took over. I do not share in that view. I rather assume that human thought at all times is a mixture of reason and myth combined in various ways. I do not address the symbolic contents of myth as only universal features rooted in the unconscious, but also as contextualized, as grounded in specific social settings, and embedded in a web of power relations. I emphasize the role of social actors and institutions as boosters of myth. And contrary to Lévi-Strauss and his followers, I do not believe that the overall architecture of myth in a given culture conforms to a basic principle of rationality and symmetry. I rather posit that while reason is undoubtedly an important component, emotion is the driving force, and that accounts for the robustness of myth. Against this backdrop, I'm turning now briefly to national myth. Basically, national myth provide a symbolic definition of a society. Such a definition always includes a narrative, the heroic beginnings of the nation, its glorious moments, 1812 now, we must say in Canada, and a vision of a future, a vision of a destiny. Examples of well-known national myths that prop up everywhere. The sense of uniqueness. Every nation feels that it is unique. The belief in a divine election and a world mission. The nation as a living body or as a family. The pure, superior national race. The sacrificed people. The external enemy. The malicious foreigners. That sort of things. In the Western world and elsewhere, those myths have transformed societies into nations, providing their members with a clear vision of themselves and others. Essentially, I want to make 3 points, and then I'm finished. But those are 3 very long points. First, national myths can be... You're still following me, Avie. He's not sleeping. That's good. I've just learned that this guy, I can say that? Yeah. He's 83 years old. I thought he was younger than me. I'm 85. National myths can be consistent and combine their effect, which creates a setup conducive to social change. I've told about that. But they can also be contradictory, and this might be very consequential as well, but in the opposite way. I think this point is front and central, and let me again turn to Quebec to get an example of that. One discern, I think, I do discern 4 master myths that has been forged in the Quebec past. Maybe there are 5 or 6, but I work with those 4. First, the longing for a national affirmation, for a reconquest, the theme of the uncompleted, unfinished societies, which is quite strong in Quebec, and an old idea, a reconquest. Second, a sense of fragility that stems from being a cultural minority in North America, and the sense that we have an obligation to fight every day to secure the survival of the language and the culture. I mean, we're raised by that kind of stuff. The third one is a taste for the vast space, exploration, the unknown, craving for change, for big projects. This is very deep in the Quebec imaginary. The last one is a sensitivity to the international sphere and a willingness to keep up with it and to adapt, to make sure that we're not, losing a step and so forth. One can observe those 4 threads interweaving throughout Quebec history, but with varying intensity from one period to another. I would say that they took turn in superseding each other and weighing on the course of the society. And this accounts for the puzzling shape of Quebec history, a mixture and a succession of bold undertakings and withdrawals, of change and stagnation. I think this is a useful key to understand Quebec past, which is very often simplified and reduced to the survival myth, if I can say. But the point I want to stress is the contradiction among those myths. Most of the time, some of them were pushing forwards, while others were holding back. And this is a very, very important phenomenon. By contrast, the 1960s were an exceptional moment of a remarkable alignment of both master and secondary myths. It was the perfect archimyth, if I can say, and major changes ensued. Likewise, English Canada since the 1960s and maybe the 1950s offers a nice example of an archimyth. One can clearly identify 2 master myths at work here. There might be, again, more than 2, but I will focus on those ones. First being a decent, candid society, and again, a world moral model. I think this has become a very, very powerful engine in the Canadian national imaginary. And second, being different from the Americans. Different and, if I dare say, morally superior to Americans. This is the hidden idea, hidden message. And from there, it is possible to infer the secondary myths of the Canadian imaginary: the peaceful, non-violent, orderly, caring, friendly, non-assuming society that worships universal health care and transfer payments, that promotes negotiation and compromise rather than confrontation, that respects diversity through multiculturalism rather than assimilation and racism, and supports peacekeeping operations across the world. I should put it in brackets because this was more true a few years ago than it is now. With a subtext, if you reverse all those threats, you get the argument of the United States, at least the Canadian vision of the American argument. This is not, there is more than a coincidence here. And exactly celebrating the 18-2 victory is fascinating as a choice, because it boosts the military and the strength, the male part of the Canadian man, sorry for you, man. And it was a victory against the United States. So my two threads are touching very nicely here. My second point relates to the tensions that accompany ethnic diversification just about everywhere in the world nowadays. I will be really quick here. In attempting to release those tensions, to prevent clashes, and to secure the integration of the nations, a lot of theories have been set forth, various formulas have been experienced, with uneven success. In short, some nations have turned to assimilation, others to, let's call it, segmentation, while others are looking for an in-between, a midway. And this is the case of Quebec with interculturalism, and now as well with the Council of Europe and many countries abroad. Common values, shared memory, multiple identities, recognition, intercultural exchange, mutual adjustments through accommodations are now well-traveled loci. But it seems to me that somehow we are missing the elephant in the room. Ethnic diversity should also be thought as an encounter of different and very often conflicting myths. The immigrants bring in, and the minorities carry with them that sort of symbolic markers that anchor their identity and their memory. I think it is at this very deep level that we should work to orchestrate ethnocultural diversity. We should ask about the narratives and the emotional pools that underpin those identities. And let me add that a similar mechanism accounts for the expressions of discomfort with, if not of outright rejection, resistance to diversity among the host societies. Since the 19th centuries, through the school system, political discourse, media, and other powerful channels, ordinary people have been taught by the elites that a nation is unique, that homogeneity is a source of cohesion and strength, that diversity is threatening, assimilation or exclusion must be the rule of the game. One should cultivate a thick, primordial sense of national identity and memory, and that a robust, well-entrenched us-them dichotomy is a necessary characteristic of a healthy nation, and so forth. For centuries, elites have tried to inculcate those views. And then, suddenly, just a few decades ago, the elites, including the highly educated members of the academia, made a hairpin turn and began to sing a very different tune. Identity is an arbitrary construct. The nation is an invention, just as traditions. Homogeneity impoverishes nations. Everybody should seek to be more cosmopolitan, more universalist, and so forth. Not surprisingly, overall, with a few exceptions, the populations did not respond very well to this new creed. Many people were just befuddled and began to distrust their elites, including the academics. Referring to Quebec, I really think that we have made a mistake in taking for granted that the public was aboard with our new pluralist, sophisticated vision, and in forgetting the depth of the imaginary that had been so forcefully implanted in the past. I think that we should have been more modest, more attentive, more understanding. We should have anticipated the feedback that did not fail to come a few years ago with the accommodation crisis. In short, the elites were faulted for betraying the very national myth that they had created in the first place. I mean, this is something that we should keep in mind. There is something important to learn from there. My last point relates to the state and the future of national myth. I'm relying here on a collection of essays that I'm presently editing. It's based on a sample of a dozen nations across the world. And one of the questions that the chapters address is the state and the future of national myth in the contemporary world. Well, it appears that in most nations, national myths are facing daunting challenges, if not a crisis. Because of the diversity factor, because of the globalization, which carries its own set of very powerful myths, and because of the widespread postmodern mindset that fosters uncertainty, suspicion, questioning, and a good deal of cynicism. England is a good case in point. Having lost its empire, having accepted devolution, and joined the European Union, this nation has lost its identity, and it has no clear view of its future anymore. Israel is torn between its old master myth, the small, besieged, resilient Jewish nation with a millenarian belief, and the modern, diversified, globalized nation. Poland, the savior Catholic nation, the former guardian of Christendom between the Eastern and the Western worlds, is struggling with a similar challenge because the young do not dare, not endorse, or not attracted by this view any longer. Japan, because of its very low fertility rate, is doomed to see its population decline by almost one-third in the next 30 years or so. Nevertheless, it still holds fast to its myth of uniqueness and inbreeding that precludes a wide opening to immigration. France, as we know, is having a hard time trying or refusing to reconcile its Republican, Jacobin creed with ethnic diversity. Belgium is not far from being a failed nation, unable to build a common worldview that would bridge the political divide. Germany, still true to its homogeneity myth, is struggling with its minorities. The United States is now seriously wondering whether it is still the promised land of the American dream, the exceptional nation that shines upon the global hill in the pursuit of happiness. Those who read the New York Times almost daily have writings about that. This is absolutely fascinating from a sociologist's point of view, at least. Russia is seeking to reinvent itself after the fall of the USSR. And as for Quebec, the four master myths that I have mentioned are now disaligned And there are clear signs that what I have called the reconquest myth is weakening now. And moreover, globalization in Quebec is seen as a threat to the French language. And that way, contradiction is making a comeback, along with expressions of insecurity and self-doubt. By contrast, English Canada is faring rather well in this class, with its powerful argument, and still powerful, I think, which is not at odds with globalization. On the contrary, globalization is seen as a tremendous opportunity to show the world the great Canadian virtues, the moral world model. But there are not many members nowadays in this very select happy club. Does that mean that national myths have no future? Not at all. I would even bet on the contrary. For one thing, the present juncture is exactly the perfect seedbed for myth making. Societies cannot live without that powerful source of meanings, of motivation, of fulfillment that engages the whole of a person intellectually and emotionally. In many places of the world, we've seen globalization spark a return to national identity and a revival of the national imaginary. What we are witnessing in many countries is a vigorous attempt to preserve the old national myths, or to adapt them, or to change them. But we see no sign of a let-up anywhere. And where this attempt seems to fail, I would say that it is lived as a void, as a deprivation, as an unfulfilled need, rather than as an achievement. And this is a feeling that cuts socially across the left-right divide and so forth. So, as to the future of national myth, a reasonable prognosis would go like this. They're not going to disappear in the foreseeable future. They are engaged in the process of adaptation, redefinition, in some cases reinvention. This process remarkably unfolds at the level of the master myth as well as the derivative myth, which is quite unprecedented. Inevitably, the new national myths will have to incorporate globalized features such as sustainability, human rights, pluralism, and so forth. Failing that, they will constantly compete with the myth carried by globalization, and over the long haul, they may lose this battle. One page of conclusion. First, I really think that in the next decades, the reconstruction of the symbolic foundation of societies will be at the top of the priorities. It should be seen as a central issue of governance, mostly because of the challenges raised by the management of diversity and by globalization. Second, myth should be brought back on the agenda of social sciences, but in a very different way than it used to be in the classical tradition of anthropology. We should know more about those very powerful mechanisms that can produce the best and the worst, and perhaps we may learn to use them for the best. Be that as it may, as yet we don't know of any substitute features or symbolic devices that can speak as powerfully both to the hearts and to the minds. Thank you very much.